Hi, Steve Gillmor. This is the Gillmor Gang. It's a special edition. Trying to get Kevin Marks on, but he may not be able to join us due to some equipment problems. Those who are joining us include Danny Sullivan. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you.
Dan Farber. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
And John Taschek.
Thank you.
All right. So, Danny Sullivan, I saw some amazing tweets from you during the course of the Boston events, and I just wanted to do a shout out to you for that. I thought it was just incredible. Could you tell the audience what it is that you were doing?
Gosh, sure. Well, I was, like everybody, I was kind of watching the news to understand everything that was going on. It kind of all came out of the blue so much. And I was just quickly going through and figuring out people who clearly were on the scene out there. There were a few reporters that you could find because their local stations were tweeting out who they were, and they were, retweeting some of the stuff that they had. And then there were some eyewitnesses and I suppose citizen journalists that were out on the ground as well. And so I created a Twitter list, and I was really watching these people who were right there out on the ground. And when I would see something that seemed very interesting, and that kind of seemed to be verified by a number of people, I would try to put that out. It wasn't always perfect. I think the worst thing was I got caught up along with a number of people where, we had seen this. The other thing that was going on is we had this police scanner that so many people were listening to. I mean, there had to have been over 500,000 people at one point listening to the live police scanners through various ways that you could do that online. And there was this student from Brown University who I guess the people at Reddit had thought might have been one of the bombers, and it turned out not to be the case, but somebody had said that they had heard him on the scanner. And I'd seen a couple people say that they had heard that who actually were clearly listening to it. And that was probably the biggest regret of the night, was that retweeting one of those sorts of things of somebody saying that as well. But it was interesting. There was just a lot of stuff, and the most bizarre thing for me was you could hear it happening on the scanner, and then it was like this bizarre tape delay where about a minute or two or three later, the media outlets that were on the scene would then report it because they were seeing it, or the police were telling them what was being said on the scanner. And then about 10 or 15 or 20 minutes later, you would see it hit CNN. So there was this really strange tape delay system that almost felt like it was in place.
It was the entire experience was, I think, will be looked back at as the moment when so-called social media and so-called mainstream media basically merged into one thing. Dan Farber is I'd say the current representative of the mainstream media on the show. What's your take?
Well, I think as you said, and as Danny described, all these things are merging together, and we have this real-time environment where there's lots of information flowing out, and then a lot of people trying to filter it. And as we know, there were different filters that worked and some that didn't. It became a bit chaotic at times, but I think it clearly showed that the so-called mainstream media and the kind of crowd media working together is something we're going to see more of in the future. We saw it during Arab Spring, and I think the challenges now are how to make it work better. So, for example, the misinformation that gets out there, such as identifying the wrong people as the perpetrators of the bombs, that kind of thing doesn't happen as easily.
Kevin Marks would join us. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there. Nice to see you. Sorry, I missed what you were saying.
We're talking about the Boston events and the intersection between mainstream and social media, it seems to. And Dan, could you just bring him up to speed a little bit on what you just said?
Well, we were talking about how while this event was going on, obviously the mainstream media was kind of leading the coverage, because I think the statistics showed that about 80% of people were getting their information from television. Certainly, a lot of people were getting it online or from the radio and other venues. But what we saw was this collision of crowdsourcing, where people trying to find out what's going on and who the perpetrators were, and a lot of misreporting going on, both from the mainstream media and from places like Reddit and other areas. And you get into the situation where people tweet and then retweet, and before you know, there's a whole cascade of misinformation going out. So I think one of the things to look at now is, how do you refine the system so that it does work better and there are better filters and not everybody's not jumping the gun on things where it leads to accusations that aren't true.
I mean, I must admit I didn't watch the TV coverage. I only saw that reflected online. But the reason I didn't watch the TV coverage is that I've decided about 5 years ago that watching live TV coverage of anything is a complete waste of time, because they sit there with air to fill and just make stuff up, or show the same clip over and over again and then randomly speculate about it. And now I'm not saying that wasn't happening on Twitter too, but at least there are many parallel voices, and I can follow branches and not be narrated at by just one. And I agree the feedback loop between the two is pretty bad, because what happens is, so rumor is started somewhere, and then it's rebroadcast by someone desperate for a scoop, without necessarily
well, that was the
hesitancy.
case. Yeah. That was the case for CNN, where they misidentified someone as a bomber, and then quickly had to correct it. But we're in this age where it's loose, and you have a choice. Do we want to roll the clock back? No. So I think it's more coming up with better ways to deal with the fact that we have so many sources of information, but we need better filters. And in the past, the filters have been the so-called mainstream media. If you look what people are retweeting, it's mostly from the mainstream media. So there needs to be some better collaboration, coordination, and I think, as some people were writing, more silence.
Right. And I think that's...
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this sort of weird thing where, where we discount things if they're on the net, but believe them if they're on TV or a print newspaper, and that's you need to apply the same sort of critical filter to everything you read, and that's something that we're gradually learning. It's the same as the Wikipedia problem, where they say, if it's been published in the newspaper, it counts as a source that we can cite, but if it's on your blog, we can't, and therefore any nonsense that's published in the newspaper gets sort of canonized in Wikipedia, and then preserved and referred to forever. And that's there are lots of people who are sort of iteratively trying to find the truth, and the sensible journalists, the responsible ones, will wait a bit before they repeat something, or they will explicitly flag it. And they will say we've got unconfirmed reports and things like that. But that as those are passed along, the caveats disappear, and you get this feedback loop that establishes something as true or likely, and that can be harder to unpick afterwards.
Well, I'll say I thought it was interesting yesterday. The AP site was hacked, and there was this tweet that went out saying there was an explosion at the White House and Barack Obama was injured. And I was actually surprised that so few immediately retweeted that. There were a number of people who clearly stopped and waited to see if there was going to be any other confirmation. Some of them that were aware of the fact that you'd had a number of media outlets that had been hacked. But I kind of felt like also, because after the events of last week, that maybe there was a little more common wisdom that got out there, that you kind of want to see the same thing being reinforced by another independent agency before you go out with something, especially something like that. So that...
Well, I thought that you really led that with your actions on what was that, Friday?
When he was actually captured.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What you were doing was basically editing the tweet sphere and providing and stating so overtly you were what's the word, curating the real-time feed and providing sort of signals as to what's authoritative and what isn't, not based on whether these people actually are correct. I mean, there was one guy who had was I've forgotten his name, but he was actually on site at the original firefight.
Right.
And he had one tweet that was really hilarious. He said he quoted a reporter on the phone saying that the air was filled with the smell of gunpowder, and then he says there is no gunpowder in the air. I mean, he basically said this person in the media is basically elaborating,
right?
Without facts. And I just thought there was something collegial about your attitude that you might have been expecting to see being fed back to you later on in the events yesterday. And I think you're a little ahead of the curve, Danny.
Well, I'll take being ahead of the curve if I can.
John Taschek.
I just wanted to get one thing in.
Sure.
This is similar to what Andy Carvin was doing for Arab Spring, and I think we'll see a lot more of it. But it's also the same thing that the networks do. For example, I worked at CBS News, and a lot of what they do is they've got 50 people in various places checking things and trying to make sure it's accurate, so the wrong information isn't reported. So they're trying to vet everything, whether it's from Twitter or the police or the scanners or whatever, before it goes on the air. So I think what we're talking about is just responsible curation.
Well, but I mean, it would be, but I felt like where CNN seemed to fall down was that you could see on Twitter that there were people who clearly were on scene and sharing good information. I mean, there were enough of them that you could verify them, and it took CNN probably an hour to an hour and a half to finally start to interview some of these people, right? And at one point I tweeted, do they not get Twitter at CNN? And what I meant by that was not that I wanted CNN to simply, broadcast anything that was out there on Twitter, but it felt like they didn't have enough of their own people on the ground, and they didn't seem to be doing that much of a job of going out there and trying to tap into the eyewitness reports that were coming in off of Twitter. And I felt like, as everybody's done these dissections of what everybody could improve, I think clearly people who are broadcasting news, if you will, through Twitter probably need to step back and take a lesson from, maybe you do need to slow down. Maybe you need to cross-verify things more and make sure that you're really confident of what you're putting out, or that you're doing a better job of qualifying stuff. And at the same time, I kind of felt like the broadcast media was like, go do your reporting, and your reporting involves talking to people who are actually telling you stuff out through social media. They're not all going to fire their eye reports, and they're not all just the police that you're actually going to be talking to. And it's, 2013 or wherever we're at, and that is part of your reporting, using these social media channels and getting there. And eventually they got them, and then it was funny because by the time they got to them, they were interviewing one or two people who had been doing a lot, but by that point everything had left Watertown, so they didn't really have anything more to say, or hadn't left Watertown, but had left their area. So, I just want to see them pull more of that stuff in there.
I think that's definitely a trend of the future, but it's still like verifying that the people are who they say they are. So one, it's, you see these people online tweeting, but you don't know if they're actually on the scene or if they're seeing things accurately. Right. And then secondly, you have to go then locate them and verify them so that you can trust that what you're putting on the air is going to be as accurate as possible. So it's just a big challenge in these live events.
Yeah, but the notion of what's on the scene is also shifted rather rapidly. I mean, what we were having here was a multiplicity of media, including these iOS and Android apps that were transmitting the scanners. So you had people who were like Danny, who was in Los Angeles, who was easily as authoritative as somebody who was, quote, on the scene.
Yeah, but you have to remember what was on the scanners was all kinds of jumble of stuff. It was, they were, it was chaos, and some of the stuff they were reporting on the scanners was not accurate. So just relying on the scanners and the whole thing of CNN as well. John King said he talked to his, to the police commissioner, and then he talked to his friend on the police force because he's from Boston. Well, that didn't turn out so well.
No, I agree that there's unauthoritative information, but I felt strongly that I think Danny sort of hinted at what I found profound about this is that regardless of what your opinion is about the source or the veracity of the information, that the fabric of real time and how that was impacting on not just on the people who were listening, but on the actual events themselves was profound. And we can say, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or this guy is showboating, or this guy is that. When you get all these signals together, if you pay attention, and if you have the access to some, curators, if you will, who attempt to provide some more signal in all the noise, you come up with something which completely changed how the networks were covering it, because the networks were, in many cases, 15, 20 minutes behind this stream of authoritative data.
I mean, to give you one sense, I mean, the scanner to me was something interesting to listen to, and occasionally helped me as I was looking at other people, understand, okay, that was probably right. And as we got into the final moments, the police at that point had asked, don't tweet anything off the scanner. And so my policy was I wasn't going to say anything I heard on the scanner unless I saw the police themselves or some media outlet out there reported that the police had told them. So it was bizarre because you could hear them saying, we're lifting the tarp up. And then, like I said, a minute later, you would see a media person at the scene saying the police are telling us they're lifting the tarp up. So then I would say, I could say both of these things had been confirmed. But it really was looking. You could go through and figure out who was on the scene, who wasn't. It's hard because there were people who were clearly on scanner who weren't on the scene, and sometimes I even felt like tried to give you the impression that they were. But there were other people you could clearly find that they were out there. And one of the people I thought was the best was this Sean Kelly TV, at Sean Kelly TV. He's a reporter for their Channel 5 out in Boston. And in that case, what happened was you had your local TV station, which is already a good source to look to, right? Just like the Boston Globe or some of the local papers had people out there as well. The stations then would start saying, we are hearing from so-and-so who had told us this is happening because they're out there, because they have a reporting crew, and the reporting crew's on the ground doing what reporting crews have done, for ages. But the difference was that then you could go through, and if you took the extra step, you could actually tap into the reporter, because some of the reporters were out there just telling you on their own tweet to everybody, this is what I've been hearing as well. And that's where I felt like I was saying, go back to the CNN, that's where I felt like they were missing out, which was they were either relying only on their own reporters, and they didn't have enough of them at first, or they were relying on whatever they got from the occasional police contact. And there was lots of police that were out there, and yet here were really good reporters. You could tell who they were. They had their profiles. You didn't really feel a lot of question about are they real or not. You could see that they were real. In some cases, a few of them were even verified. At least their publications themselves that were out there. So that to me was interesting. If we used to talk about this idea of if you remember from Back to the Future, he'd had the TV screen and they'd have all those different channels, and you put on this channel, put on that channel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For me, that night when I created the Twitter list that started with 19 people who were on scene and grew to like 40 people, it was like I had 40 different channels into what was happening from people I actually trusted that were on the scene, but consolidated into a single feed. It was like 40 different reporters all coming into one broadcast. And that was interesting.
John Taschek, I'm sorry, Dan. Let me hear from John Taschek just to get him into this a little.
I think there's a lot of people who clearly Twitter had an impact on the media here because just the quantity of information that's coming out. But at the same time, the traditional media, I think, it's almost impossible to embrace this kind of fire hose of stuff because they're getting so much information. And if you compare it to like what the police were getting right after the suspect's picture was put up on the news, I think the tip line, the phone line for the police was like 300,000 tips a minute. You know, they have to screen all these things. It can be very distracting. They don't know what to do. But so it's impossible to vet these things coming out. What they do is have to treat it as a source of information, and traditional media has to somehow incorporate that into their feeds as maybe it's not validated information or something to that effect. That said, I think most of the world was not tuned into the actual real-time part of this. And they're waiting for later. Like we were in Los Angeles when this was happening, and although I thought the most riveting television of since the OJ case was happening when they were surrounding the guy in the boat, and I guess Danny was talking a lot about this, but I was in the car listening to it, and I heard it through traditional media. I was tuned into CNN and Fox and things like that, and just listening in the car. But in Los Angeles the day before, when a lot of this was happening in the evening, so this was 9 p.m. or so. No TVs were on. Nobody was really talking about it. No one really knew about it. They're kind of waiting for the next day.
Well, it was L.A., for God's sake.
but on the way back, I pulled over and I was to get something to eat, and I was watching the news, and a trucker had come by. Now truckers are tuned into all sorts of broadcast information, CB radio. I actually don't know what they use anymore, but and the guy said, "What's that? What's going on? I haven't heard anything about this." And it was like he had not even heard that there was an explosion in Boston. So it was pretty, it's just like there's a whole cross section of people.
Well, that's why Jay Leno is still on TV.
They didn't realize that Carson was off.
Well, his thing where exactly. He goes out on the street and asks people about the Constitution, and well, I don't think that's a good idea. Freedom of the speech, I'm not sure. Anyway, Dan Farber, I interrupted you.
I was just going to point out that this situation is not unique. If you recall the West, Texas, and there was a lot of misinformation coming out of there, especially I think in the kind of first hours or so. Some authority or an official said, "Oh, there are 60 dead and 100 wounded." I think the final count was 15 dead. So
that's right, and that was from the doctor who was on the scene. He said at one time he said over 100 dead, and it was the local doctor because he was looking at all the houses that had been blown apart.
Well, he hadn't said there were 100 dead. He said that he feared there could be up to that many dead, and then that got turned into 100 dead.
Yeah, that's right.
But what Danny said, what we're talking about is that it's really the local people who probably have the best angle on these kinds of stories. They don't necessarily always get it right, as in the West Texas situation, but they have the contacts. They're closer to the local authorities. But then when these things escalate and it gets to the FBI and places like that, then maybe some of the more major networks have better access.
That's true. The other thing that happened that same night, Danny had at one point had a link that he published, which he said basically was the best video feed at the time. And I've been trying to use TV Anywhere to everywhere or somewhere, maybe nowhere, as the case was. I couldn't get my authentication from Comcast to work, et cetera, et cetera. I was changing passwords, trying to get a video, and then Danny posts this signal from some local station. And for the rest of the night, basically, I was watching this. It was free, in the clear, no restrictions. It was a local, to your point, Dan, it was a local signal. And it was like being there. The other thing I wanted to mention is that because of these smartphones now, or superphones, or whatever you want to call them, the content, not just tweets and Facebook, but video and audio, is difficult to distinguish from network news cameras in these events. And much as what we saw with the in Russia with the asteroid hitting, because of their peculiar situation regarding people gaming the legal system, everybody's got a camera in their car now that's running all the time, and we are now in that situation. I mean, the footage from the actual bombing was instrumental in, not just showing who the perpetrators were, but also their attitudes. There was one picture which was posted on Facebook, which showed them sort of looking the other way with a calm expression on their face, while everybody else was reacting with horror. I mean, it was just these kinds of crowdsourced bits of information. It may have taken them, quote, a long time to be able to assimilate it, but go ahead, Dan.
I think those pictures you're talking about actually came from a security camera from a store that the authorities got. And when things were getting out of hand, they decided, well, let's put these out because there's just too much craziness going on out there.
Yeah, there was one picture that was actually posted on Facebook, which was somebody had taken a shot, and the surviving suspect was. It's that there are other shots from security cameras that showed the same thing, but this was the first time that you actually got a good close-up look at the guy, and also the context of it, because the boy who was killed was in a wider shot, was in the same frame.
Yeah, but I think overall, in hindsight, looking back, this is a pretty easy crime to solve.
Yeah. I would think that they understood that when they architected it as well.
Yeah, part of what they had to do is build up the case.
I'm sorry, you're kind of breaking up a little.
Sorry. Part of what they had to do is build the case, make sure that they are following all sorts of procedures in order to, have the evidence necessary for the court case, and that's going to happen over the next year, I guess.
Well, I want to broaden this a little bit because we don't have a lot of time today. Just to talk about obviously we have a lot of discussions in the technology arena about privacy and some of those aspects. It seems like this is an intersection of those two issues, and I know that there are people on both sides of this argument, which I have a great deal of respect for. My feeling is that, as a parent, I would like there to be as much visual coverage of public events as possible, just to dissuade people, to Dan's point, from from doing something which they are going to be immediately apprehended. Now, the opposite argument is that that's a police state in 1984, etc. Let's start with Dan. What's your take on that? How do you fall on that spectrum?
Well, these were not very clever bombers, obviously. So I think, with all this technology around in the future, people are going to be much more surreptitious and clever about how they try to disguise themselves. But you can also imagine a future when people have all this wearable technology and they're streaming. That one scenario would be, and I'll just pick Google Glass as an example. If you have all these people wearing Google Glass, and this is very hypothetical and hope it's not the kind of thing that happens regarding privacy, but somebody could go to Google and say, we want to look at, we want to process on these massive scale servers all of the data coming in from Glass at these locations during these time frames. And there would be software that could pick out those two guys in probably 1 minute.
Well, Dan, why didn't they? Because one of the guys was, in this case, was followed by or interviewed by the FBI before. He must have been on some kind of list. Why wouldn't they just pick it up through facial detection right away?
Facial detection doesn't work.
Yeah,
in that
pictures is terrible.
Yeah, that was one of the things that came out of this, is that they discovered that their facial detection, even when they knew that the picture was within.
That's why when you go to have your picture taken at the DMV, they just stand you there like that. So there is facial recognition, but it's only if they can get an image that's similar, in terms of the orientation to what you did for your official badge.
I just thought that they have a setting for the most unattractive possible picture of you.
The DMV.
Yeah. Kevin, what do you think?
Well, facial recognition is useless at this because it's the wrong case for it. It works when you're trying to match one person from a set of candidates you've already got, but trying to pick out one person from 10,000 in the crowd isn't going to do much. So, and they said it didn't help them. But as you say, what helped was lots of people looking at the pictures and saying, "Wait a minute, that guy's looking the wrong way. There's two guys here with backpacks saying next to each other. Here's a photograph of them without." And that's what there was a lot of that going on in the 4chan and Reddit world. And they basically posted pictures of every person carrying a backpack at that thing, and then would try to narrow it down. And then they were trying to identify them, which is where they went off the rails a bit. But I think the image analysis stuff they were doing was useful, and I think it did. They ended up with a list of 10 or so people carrying obviously heavy backpacks in the area, which did include both the suspects, who were eventually apprehended or ran away. The trickier bit of it is how how you combine these two, and also, are they looking at this as well? There's this sort of weird people dissociate them, so what they do on the internet from reality, even as they're interacting with reality there. When as they examine all these photographs, they're not thinking, oh, these people might be looking at it and seeing if we're close. That's the bit that's strange, and it's striking that these bombers didn't have a follow-up plan. There isn't a defense against a suicide bomber. If you look at the London attacks, where you had 4 guys with backpacks killing lots of people, but they killed themselves as well. And so then they don't need an escape plan, and that's really, really hard to defend against. Whereas these guys managed to do this, walk away, and then hang around town for 4 days, which is weird. And clearly they weren't thinking this through. But that's the other thing is and assuming that they're smart is possibly part of our mistake. So we say, well, they must have had a smarter plan than that. So no, clearly they didn't.
All right. So Dan, you have to go soon, right?
I'll be okay for a little while.
Oh, okay, good. Well, then I'll ease off on John. You have to leave it in 6 minutes. So what else do we want to talk about? Anything interesting to you? I thought Tim Cook's suggestions that they're coming up with something, but it's not too soon, was interesting. Some sort of new revolutionary tangent that they're going to go off on.
I mean, one thing I thought was interesting is that all the Samsung S4 reviews came out yesterday, and I actually got the Note 8, not the S4, but the Note 8. So I got to spend some time playing with the Samsung stuff as well. And I think it was one of the Wired reviews that captured exactly what I was thinking. Was, you look at it and you're like, it almost feels like you're just trying to figure out what else you can throw onto this so that it doesn't just look like it's stock Android. And and also that there wasn't anything really revolutionary in these phones. I can't remember if that was The Verge that said that or not. It might have been a CNET review, but one of them was, that are we at that point where we don't have to have any more cores in our phone and we don't have to have any more display, and it's just there are
Right.
these little tweaks that are kind of with it. And
It's too
I
fast for me. I don't want any more speed. I don't want any more storage.
Yeah, exactly. That was the argument that against Intel when they came out with the 486. Who needs a 486? We don't need any more speed, And then, well, it didn't stop.
Yeah, I think it's a bit different. I don't think it was so much now that people are saying who needs more speed, because to be honest, if I took you out and I bought you a computer and it had an i3 or it had an i7 in it, you might not really know the difference, a typical person. To whereas if I had given you a 386 and a 486, you knew the difference a lot more.
You didn't because they were running DOS at the time though, and the difference on DOS and a 386 and a 486 was there's zero. But then people started adding services onto them. The same thing they're going to do with the mobile devices, I think.
Well, and like my Galaxy Nexus is now up to Android 4.2.2, and I'm really feeling that how that phone doesn't have the processor to run it now. I'm almost like, gosh, I used to say I want my Android upgrades, but now I'm really sorry about getting it for this one.
Why? It's choking it now with too much
it just
stuff?
sits there, and like you take the phone, you rotate it, and it goes, "Oh, you want to rotate? Okay.
Well,
here we're rotating now. Okay, there we go."
Jelly Bean sped up my Razor and it made the camera about 5 times faster, but I can see
This
that.
is a Rip Van Winkle moment. Jelly Bean just sped up my Razor. What the hell are you talking about?
Wonk. Wonk alert.
Dan, what about you? What device are you enamored of or not?
Well, I have my iPhone, and like everybody else, it's like, come on, get on with the program, Apple. The last thing they introduced was, I think, the iPad Mini in October, and so we're supposed to wait till the fall for something new from Apple while everybody else is cranking out stuff. But of course, Apple, Tim Cook would say, well, all the products coming out from our competitors are crappy. We would never do anything like that.
Well, I agree with that, but that's just me.
I mean, it's one thing I'm surprised that with the iPad Mini, it is a great device, and as I've played with the Note 8, and I've looked at of course the Nexus 7. The thing that's most striking about it is you really miss the Retina display. I mean, it's not. I use it every day, but really, when you compare it to the other tablets, it doesn't feel as clear. So you just sort of like, you're not at least going to roll out a Retina iPad Mini? I mean, come on.
Well, when you get to be my age, nothing looks clear. So I'm actually over the hump.
It needs a Retina display, though, I think.
Oh, I can't wait. And I think that's what they'll ship, something like that in October.
Right. Yeah. And the point is to make it where they can make the price point for it.
I think it's more
they schedule products by price point, not by tech.
I think it's the weight. I think it's the weight as much as anything.
Yeah, the weight too. But there's a balancing act between what Apple releases as a lower price point, because they can't cannibalize other things. I mean, it hurts their street number too much, and that's a balancing act that Tim Cook has to play.
Well, no, because what they do is they use last year's model as the low price point. That's what they've done with the iPhones.
Yeah, but they can't do that anymore. There's competition.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that Danny's point about
there is competition,
but the fragmentation is caused
I think they
by.
can still do it, and the point is that, it helps them attack the competition to some extent. But Apple, if you actually look at some Asimco or somebody did a great graph of average selling price of Apple products over time, and they were remarkably horizontal lines for a Mac, for an iPad, for an iPhone. The average selling prices were pretty much straight lines for several years in a row. And that is a hint that that's what they're saying. They're saying, okay, we'll make the best product we can that hits this price point, because that's the price point we're comfortable selling, and we may create a new product at a different price point and maintain that as well. And the way they've been doing that is to move the last year's product down to the lower price point and keep that going along. So It's
It's a new world. They can't do that anymore. Microsoft had struggled with that now, and now they've released this, whatever this Office suite is. It's software for 5 users for $99 a month. They can't do the same things anymore. There's competition out there. There's also economics that are happening. There's bubbles that are happening in different markets, but the rest of America is depressed, and the rest of the world is not coming back up yet, and they have to get to the world. They have to get to these other pockets of the world, right, in order to sell these things at different prices. And that's what they have to do. It's just a business decision.
Well, I think what Danny talks about in terms of the surfeit of features, I think that lends to the whole problem of in terms of the kinds of glut of features that Office and Word, for example, started to experience, where the net value of new features becomes actually a negative rather than a positive, because you have to develop interfaces for the most favorite features and take the rest of them off of the interface. And I think that we're seeing that with what's going on with Android. But all right, so let's just go quickly around the table. John had to leave, and we'll start with Danny. Just sort of a summary of where we are technically as well as socially.
Crazy as we ever was. I don't know. I mean, I would say that the past week simply shows you that nothing is settled at all. We're still figuring it all out, as we always do have to figure things out. But that we probably get to a better place with all this sort of stuff. I think last week was a really big move for the mainstream news outlets and people who tune into them to understand how they can make better use of social media. It was just, I think it would have been easy for you to think, oh yeah, they know how to deal with all that social media stuff now. The CNN, they got all that stuff down and everything. And I think actually it helps you realize, no, they don't. They still are trying to figure the best way to bring this into it. And I think it also underscored that for all the people earlier in the week who wanted to say, hey, the mainstream media is dead, it's all on Twitter now, you understood that it may all be on Twitter, but there's a lot of other stuff on Twitter that is bad or that's not accurate. And so, no, you actually rely on both of these things to try to figure out what the actual picture is.
Dan?
Well, I think one of the interesting things last week was that the Boston Police Department tweeted out that they had captured the younger bomber. And that's how most of the news outlets found out. So to me that says that Twitter has risen to be this incredible near real-time or real-time source of information that people now are using to get their information out, to broadcast their information. And that the news outlets, obviously need to pay a lot of attention to social media, but, their job to a large degree is to provide the curation and to, connect all the dots. So that function is still important, whether it's CBS News or any other outlet, or Danny Sullivan curating the event in real time, or Andy Carvin. So this is a big ongoing shift where we will see the kind of the digital social network world become more integrated with the kind of more establishment world of curation.
Kevin?
Well, I think that's right. I think with what we've seen over the last few days has been these very good, well-researched, well-written, long-form pieces that give some context and background to this stuff. And for me, I think it is that somebody put a thing up saying the experiment with 24-hour TV news has failed. We need to stop doing it. And I think that sort of summed up my thinking. Every time I've tried to watch any kind of live TV news thing, I've just given up on it because the structure of it militates against understanding completely. And what you find is that those, you can construct like the New York Times piece where they found all the people near the blast, interviewed them, and put that up. There are ways of constructing very good bits of journalism and reportage with this stuff, but it's very, very hard to get a coherent narrative out in real time, and it's completely antithetical to one person standing in front of a TV with people throwing things at them to read out, and then making up the bits in between.
Well, I agree with everything that each of you has said. I do think that the fact of social media and of these powerful mobile devices has changed not only how stories are reported, but as I said before, actually what the story is. And I think that it's going to be incumbent upon mainstream media to be able to be more interactive rather than less, because they're in effect covering the social media story as part of the event. So it's not a question of sidestepping it or competing with it. It's a question of absorbing it,
Right.
and as Danny did, making some more sense. I mean, the signal to noise of Danny's feed was extraordinary, but you could start to see some of the contributors starting to recognize, as a result of their placement on an authoritative list, they started to be more responsible in terms of their reporting, which it's a feedback loop that I think we saw happening on both sides of what used to be a fence between the two medias. I want to thank Rackspace, and particularly Rob Legess, for bringing the show back to the air, whatever the air is these days. And new tech for the TriCaster, our producer and director, Tina Chase Gillmor. I want to thank John Taschek, who you don't need to cut to his empty screen, but you will anyway. Danny Sullivan from Los Angeles. Thank you, Danny.
Sure.
I don't know where you are, Dan Farber, but you're looking good.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Okay, well, I hope you do it again soon, real time. And Kevin Marks, as always, fantastic.
Thank you, Steve.
And unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to look at the chat room, if there is one, but
It's fairly quiet because people didn't realize it.
yeah. But thank you for attending, and this should be up. I'm not sure whether I'll wait for Saturday or put this up tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who showed up, and especially those who didn't. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.